I was wondering whether the glass would hold on an angle. Let me start by saying that I see that two of the distinguished speakers that spoke here, I really identify with them on many grounds. But the main ground is that they came after their speeches with scarves and with coats, and I was sitting here freezing. So the only way to begin this lecture is by starting to warm up a little bit in the hope that I'll be coherent. So first of all, my thanks to Professor Christian Wieser, especially for making the introduction short. And of course to Stefan Vogt, who I met in various places, and I'm delighted to be here. Also, this is not my talk yet. And by the way, I think German audiences must be given medals, because after 3 long lectures, you are still sitting in the hall waiting for yet another lecture. You all deserve a serious vote of thanks, especially to somebody who's come from quite far away. But I wanted to say, I was in the Jüdische Museum about 15 years ago, and it was terrible. What you have done now is remarkable. And what I would like to say here, actually, is that I am a dinosaur in technological terms. And most people nowadays have PowerPoint. There is a section in the Jüdische Museum which is about the Frankfurter Juden and the Moderne. That could have been the PowerPoint for this lecture. Unfortunately, we can't all set off to the museum, so we'll have to use your imagination, or maybe later make another visit to the museum. So the official invitation to deliver this lecture, for which I'm grateful, states that it should deal with the pre-Nazi period. That is to say, the conference is from 1933 on, and Stefan asked me to give the introduction just prior to the Nazi period. And the description said the following: in which, above all, Frankfurt's Jewish intellectuals epitomized liberal Weimar and pre-Weimar culture. So we're talking here about the invitation that I received. So this lecture is about these intellectuals and not the general nature of the organized Jewish community, which we heard so much about, and I know is the rest of the conference. Now, I know very often that urban or city histories can be terribly boring. But in the case of Frankfurt, as I discovered, there is no lack of drama, and there is certainly a great deal of diversity and conflict, which makes it particularly interesting. And it's surprising to me, because in the main historiography, the cities that most are emphasized for the Weimar period are Berlin and München. And I always had this impression, well, Frankfurt, yeah, okay, but it's not Berlin and it's not Munich. That's a great mistake, because it has become a really exciting assignment because of the abundance of fascinating and sometimes really idiosyncratic Jewish scholars and intellectuals, and their manifold range of ideological, political, and cultural positions. As one participant remembered, somebody you may not have heard of, Dov Goitein, the great scholar, he said at this time, Frankfurt vibrated with spirituality. So we really are confronted here with an embarrassment of riches, and the material almost overwhelms the time that I have. Actually, I'm not sure I had to give the lecture at all, because many of the names that I'm going to deal with were mentioned by previous speakers. So I hope that, in a sense, this will be familiar. So, liberal Frankfurt. But at the moment we hear liberal Frankfurt, we have to make qualifications. In the first place, we have to question the blanket statement that Frankfurt, both in its Jewish and its non-Jewish incarnations, wasn't really the epitome of an exclusively liberal pre-Weimar and Weimar city. We will see to some extent this is true. I'm not questioning that. That is true. But as a generalization, it doesn't really cover the large range of ideas, attitudes, and ideologies that characterize the period's politics and its thought. For in many rather surprising ways, Frankfurt appears as a kind of microcosm of the contradictory and creative tensions of the wider, radical, polarized Weimar culture. Its intellectuals and opinion makers reflected the Republic's multiple shifting patterns and its variety of dynamic, cultural, philosophical, artistic currents, as well as its diverse political tendencies. Of course, there were liberals. Absolutely, there were liberals. But in the intellectual world here, there were also conservative, folkish, and proto-fascist, as well as radical, neo-Marxist, and existentialist theorists and politicians and thinkers. So, difficult as this may be, how does one do justice to all of these currents? And they were entangled in a very creative, but also dangerous vortex of change. They were very visible. So I don't think one can really find a single element, a single continuity here. That becomes extremely difficult. Continuity existed with change. Nevertheless, I think we can define what we mean when we think of Weimar culture. I think in the most basic way, radical Weimar culture was most urgently a post-World War culture. Now, I know that in front of Jewish audiences, quite correctly, World War II and the Shoah have overwhelmed our memory of World War I. But if we put ourselves back, the impact of World War I was enormous. And Weimar culture was, in a sense, a post-World War culture, an expression of and a response to its traumatic predicament that demanded remarkably novel and creative responses. Radicals of the left, right, and the Jewish kind shared a certain temperament, a certain affinity, a sensibility that by and large was not liberal, but was post-liberal. And it was based on the ruins of a newly discovered disbelief in the old political, moral, and cognitive order. For all their differences, and they were many, many, thinkers of the radical right, like Martin Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, Ernst Junger, the new Western Marxists, such as Walter Benjamin and the Frankfurt School, and we'll come back to them, and those involved what became the Jewish Renaissance. In our context, the main person here being Franz Rosenzweig and the Jüdische Lehrhaus, all of these advocated a kind of root rethinking that explored new ways in which to comprehend, first of all, this massive European catastrophe, and then to try to provide radical new paths and solutions for its predicament. So basically, there was a sense of crisis and rupture, which generated a new attempt to find new ways of thinking and dealing with political and social reality. Nevertheless, if so much of this was radical, I will agree here that much of it was against bourgeois liberalism, but it is precisely Frankfurt's liberal openness, its liberalism, that provided physical and mental space for its expression. If you didn't have a liberal culture, you could not have all these kind of different tendencies to be expressed. And there is no doubting Frankfurt's liberal disposition. I don't want to be misunderstood. I hardly need to remind this audience that Frankfurt's history is essentially, if there is a German liberalism, it's in Frankfurt and in its central institutions. The groundbreaking 1848 Paulskirche Parliament was the first freely elected all-German parliament, and the democratic model for the late Weimar Constitution of 1919 and the basic laws of 1949 for the Federal Republic of Germany. Now, we're coming to some of the things that were mentioned. This liberal sensibility was obviously unmistakably present in the long and distinguished pre-1933 career of the Frankfurter Zeitung, and equally so for this university, not surprisingly called the Goethe Institute, University. To my amazement, in its present guise, this university was founded as late as 1914. And it is important to note that it was privately endowed and funded significantly, with 2/3 of the capital coming from various members of the Frankfurt Jewish community. Most prominently, the forward-looking Wilhelm Moses, who later changed his name to Wilhelm Ralph Merton, the Speyer family, and the industrialists Leo Ganz and Arthur von Weinberg. That fact distinguished the Goethe University, I keep on saying institute, the Goethe University, it distinguished them from the far more authoritarian, traditional Prussian state version. And it was indeed from its beginning inspired by an emancipatory and Enlightenment Goethean kind of vision. In other words, there was a cosmopolitanism here. From its beginnings, the university encouraged openness and experimentation. Of all the state ministries of culture in Germany, Frankfurt, with its mercantile nature, was the most freewheeling and Republican. And this explains partly the remarkable, even if it was delayed for too long, the remarkable prominence of Jewish thinkers in Frankfurt, both within the privately owned Frankfurter Zeitung, the university, but also, as you've already heard, semi-autonomous separate institutions like the Frankfurter Schule and, of course, the Jüdische Lehrhaus of Franz Rosenzweig. We'll soon discuss some of the figures there, but it was precisely, he said, there's always an opposite here. It was the openness of the Goethe Institute University, which so encouraged Jewish participation. But it was also perhaps this Traditionslosigkeit that rendered the penetration of National Socialism so easy. And it happened quite quickly. Very soon after the Machtergreifung, the Nazi ideologue Ernst Krieg became rector of this university. He was replaced by Walter Platzow, an ardent anti-Semite and member of the SS. And in 1937, none other than Josef Mengele joined Frankfurt's Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene, which was headed by Ottmar von Verscheuer, who specialized in the study of twins. But let's get back to our main concern. Let's begin with the Frankfurter Zeitung. It's an example of the complicated liberalism of the city, because it was essentially liberal, yet very open to all kinds of different visions, positions, and ideologies. It was never a mass circulation paper. It was really a liberal bourgeois organ founded by the Jewish-born Leopold Sonnemann in 1856. He was a founder of the Liberal German People's Party in 1868 and its first delegate to the Reichstag. Through the marriage of his daughter, the paper stayed in family hands and was managed by Kurt and Heinrich Simon, Sonnemann's grandsons. During the Weimar period, always under very difficult political and economic circumstances, the paper maintained its liberal democratic position. And while its leader, Heinrich Simon, was much more in the mold of a classical 19th century literary and musical Bildungsbürger, the feuilleton was remarkably open to all kinds of modernist currents and radical left, as well as right-wing opinions and personalities. In that way, it perfectly reflected the creative crises and tensions that made up the fertility of Weimar culture, and at the same time made Weimar culture particularly fragile or dangerous. Who were these people? They were a host of remarkable outsider Jewish figures, many of whom became famous intellectual and literary icons of the Western world. They weren't necessarily living here, but they were all part of the Frankfurter Zeitung culture. These included luminaries, somebody who became very famous only in the last 20 years in the non-German world, Siegfried Kracauer. Need once mention that it was Walter Benjamin who was writing for the paper. And of course, Josef Roth, who we will come to. And perhaps, too, somebody mentioned Margarete Sussman. At last, I thought, basically, I have a problem with this talk. It's a very male talk. And so I was delighted to find Margarete Sussman, who's very problematic, come to that, and another woman who is also problematic and fantastic and interesting. And there's a street in her name, Bertha Pappenheim. So I'll come to the women later, but it is a fact that it is a very male-oriented subject. Good that we have these examples. So whatever the misleading and hostile notion, of course, remember the Jewish press, there isn't a single intent of a Jewish press here, obviously. But still, the Frankfurter Zeitung was owned by these Jewish owners, and many of its contributors, not all, were Jewish. As with the other institutions that I'll examine, these figures contributed to the a culture which denies the truism about German Jewish intellectuals. There is a kind of historical assertion that all German Jews were somehow intrinsically liberal and possessed, in the spirit of Goethe, Frankfurt's most famous son, a passionate, if naive, belief in the redemptive power of Bildung. Now, there is truth to these propositions, but they require qualification and nuance. In the first place, while they were all forced by the hostile atmosphere of the times to confront the question of their Jewishness, each of the individuals I've mentioned here regarded their own Jewishness in very different ways. Heinrich Simon, for instance, was baptized as a child, and though he later left the church, he never formally returned to Judaism. And yet, he immigrated to Palestine in 1934, and always the musical Bildungsbürger, became the first manager and co-founder in 1936 of the Palestine Symphony Orchestra. After 1934, he was reputed to say, "I will never say the word Germany again." The whole story of Heinrich Simon is very interesting. He left later for the United States and was murdered in 1941 in Washington and no one has a clue to this day what exactly happened and why. So, unlike Simon, the Jewishness of Krakauer, I don't know if you know this, but his uncle, Isidor Krakauer, was a historiographer of Frankfurt Jewry. So Krakauer, Walter Benjamin, and Joseph Roth all accepted their Jewishness, but all stood outside of Jewry's organized collective expressions. Nor were any of them, Walter Benjamin maybe can talk about that. None of them were really Zionists. And perhaps, most importantly, none can really be described as classically liberal. Both Benjamin and Krakauer regarded themselves as on the radical left. Indeed, as far as Gershom Scholem was concerned, Benjamin's Judaism was deluded by his Marxism. And what about somebody like Joseph Roth? For him, Jewishness was not characterized by liberalism or any kind of religious commitment. In fact, at certain moments, Joseph Roth expressed a certain allegiance to Catholicism. For him, Jewishness was about wandering and displacement. He was, if you like, a passionate poet of the dispossessed. If he had any love, it was for the vanished Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, you know the Radetzky March. He was brilliant, lonely, conflicted, argumentative. He was opposed to all nationalisms, including, quite viciously, Zionism. He wrote about Zionism's triumph over the Arabs, the view that the Jews are more clever than other peoples is nonsense. Not only are they not cleverer, they are often even sometimes stupid. That's Joseph Roth. As an embittered, self-driven exile, he had very little in common with his bourgeois colleagues, and he increasingly identified deeply with the persecuted and wandering East European Jews, which he documented in his 1927 Juden auf Wanderschaft. His pieces in the Frankfurter Zeitung, by the way, are still very much worth reading to this day. He was not an easy guy. He was very friendly with Siegfried Krakauer, but he couldn't stand Krakauer's turn to the left. So he lashed out at him for forgetting his Jewish faith and replacing it with political fanaticism. I quote, "Dr. Krakauer has angered me greatly. He is one of the Jehovah Jews, and Marxism is his Bible. The Eastern Jews have a good word for such men, God's policemen." But what is most important about Krakauer, and to some extent Walter Benjamin, is not just the rejection of bourgeois liberalism, but a turning away from the classical ideal of Bildung. Traditionally, Bildung was associated, as we all think we are probably here, with high culture, classical music, Humboldtian humanism, Goethe and Schiller's literature, and Kant's philosophy. 19th century Jewry, emancipating Jewry, were indeed like this. But many of Weimar's Jewish intellectuals, perhaps centrally Krakauer, though they were highly educated and cultured, found high Bildung far less interesting than mass culture. Together with Walter Benjamin, in some of his moods, Krakauer pioneered the study and the importance of everyday popular life, of movies and mass ornaments, of architecture, shopping malls, urban spaces, railway stations. It's surely significant in this regard, and I didn't know this either, that it was uniquely in Frankfurt that pioneered mass radio. The Südwestdeutsche Rundfunk was a highly progressive experimental mass medium that didn't just feature highbrow music, literature, and philosophy, which they did, but also the novel ideas of accessible popular radio plays, Hörspiel, and more importantly, pioneers in sport reporting. Now, why am I talking about this? Because it was led by very young people under the age of 30, and its leader was the half-Jewish Hans Flesch, who pioneered this approach and who featured people like Bertolt Brecht, Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, and Paul Hindemith, who otherwise would never have reached mass audiences. So if 19th century Jews were part of classical Bildung, the early 20th century counterparts discovered the centrality of popular entertainment and mass media, both as theoreticians and entrepreneurs. Because they were social outsiders, they were less tradition-bound than their compatriots, more open to the new, receptive to the experimental and to modernist currents. But I want to show too that the rebellion against classical Bildung also took place in the political world, not just the cultural world, and the Judaic world. Let's turn to the university where we are now and its related institutions. Again, the Jewish presence was impressive, multidisciplinary, very often distinguished, and as we know now, always dangerously visible. That's one of the great dilemmas. Because of the university's relatively new history, and because systematic discrimination had left Jews out of official university positions, many of these appointments were made very late, only a few years before the Nazis came to power. Now, there's always a problem. Contribution history is the worst kind of history. Oh, these Jews did this. There was Einstein, and there was, shouldn't say, Karl Marx, and they were good guys. And then you have a problem. What do you do with the bad guys? So I'm not suggesting contribution history here, but I will say that there were the achievements and the diversity was quite remarkable. Just to have a look at this list. Faculty members included the Nobel Prize winner Max Born and Otto Stern in physics, the mathematician Max Dehn, the legal scholars Hugo Zinsheimer. I don't know if you know about Hugo Zinsheimer. He was widely considered the father of labor law in Germany, and who was very active in the Another thing I didn't know, there was a Frankfurt Revolution in 1918. I didn't know. It's always Berlin and Munich. And Hugo Zinsheimer, actually, in 1918, took charge of the police headquarters in Frankfurt, something that I'm not sure how many people are aware. And then there was people, very important legal scholars like Hermann Heller, who were in part of the legal structure. If there's discussion, I can explain what Hermann Heller said. But again, Frankfurt as a pioneer in sociology. Sociology as a separate discipline was recognized very late in Germany. Max Weber, for instance, had his appointment in 1894 in economics in Freiburg. Franz Oppenheimer, also a Zionist, became the very first occupant of a German chair in sociology at the Goethe Institute in Frankfurt in 1919. And again, I'm saying institute. I'm leaving. The sociologist, the very famous sociologist, Karl Mannheim, followed Oppenheimer. And Mannheim brought with him somebody who subsequently became even more famous, Norbert Elias, as his assistant. And I'm glad to say, somebody who later became probably one of the leading Jewish historians of his time, Yaakov Katz, was Mannheim's student. We could go on and on. Need I mention the professor was somebody who was promoted to a professor of philosophy in 1930. We'll encounter him a few more times. His name was Max Horkheim. And of course, I haven't mentioned a fellow whose name must be well known to you, Martin-Buber. And Buber association with the university stretched back as far as 1923. To all this, we have to add the controversial and famous, some would say infamous historian, Ernst Kantorowicz, who similarly received his honorary Frankfurt professorship in 1930. I'll get to Kantorowicz a little later. This lecture does have an ending. I promise you, a day or two and we'll be finished. What in hindsight can we make of all of this? It's true that most of these scholars were liberal or they were defiantly on the left. But differences in politics and modes of identification varied widely. We can't make any generalization as to the degree of Jewish commitment amongst these thinkers. Well, Martin Buber's Jewish commitment was never in question, but it received very serious criticism from his Frankfurt colleagues. When he and Franz Rosenzweig translated the Bible into German, their colleague Siegfried Krakauer said of the translation that it is essentially folkish in nature, and that Buber's Zionist-related employment of archaic German, such as words like Erdvolk and Kunde, was a form of neo-romantic irrationalism. And like Buber, Franz Oppenheimer too was a leading Zionist, but of an earlier liberal, less radical generation that completely rejected Martin Buber's idea of a specifically Jewish cultural renaissance. I quote Oppenheimer, "We cannot be Jewish by culture because the Jewish culture as it had been preserved from the Middle Ages in the ghettos of the East stands lower than modern culture, which our Western nations bear." And what is one to make of the case of the Jewishness of Ernst Kantorowicz? He was essentially indifferent to his Jewishness. He was an adherent of the Stefan George Kreis. He was neither left nor liberal, but a radical nationalist conservative who earlier had served in the Freikorps and was less concerned with critical analysis than actually forging a mythical vision of history, a kind of heroizing, inspiring German myth. And this was true for his very famous 1927 Kaiser Friedrich II, which is a classic of this myth-making kind. It didn't help him when the Nazis came to power, and like the other Jews, he was dismissed from his post. And his attitude to National Socialism remains very unclear. He even wrote to Stefan George in 1933, "If fate one denies one's access to the Reich, and as a Jew or colored, one is necessarily excluded, then one will have to bring up amor fati and make one's decisions accordingly." He went to the United States and there acted very bravely when he opposed, he refused to sign the McCarthy Oath of Loyalty. And in 1957, he penned an absolutely classical study of monarchy called The King's Two Bodies. Now, I'm sure in Germany, maybe not as much as in Britain, you've all watched the funeral of the Queen. If you want to see Ernst Kantorowicz's theory come out, you just have to watch the televised version, because there is the physical burial and there is the symbolic material. Those are the king's two bodies. And I've never seen Kantorowicz come so alive as in the last few weeks. In fact, perhaps too alive. It didn't stop. It was a funeral that I think took a month. Now, who was the opposite to Kantorowicz? The real opposite to Kantorowicz, he may be forgotten today, but in his own time was remarkably popular and well known, Karl Mannheim. He really was a rational liberal. opposed to all these kind of mad, bizarre currents floating around, and sought mightily to give this culture some kind of coherency. His exercise in the sociology of knowledge, the 1929 Ideology and Utopia, saw worldviews as springing from and reflecting social and class locations. And then he said, how do we bring this all together? He had this idea, of course, completely wrong, that it's the intellectuals who were freischwebender, who were absolutely above all of these things. They could create some kind of consensus. Of course, that's quite untrue. Like Kantorowicz, Mannheim did not at all regard his Jewish origins as important. In fact, he denied its relevance. He never addressed himself to Jews, the question of Jews in Germany, either before or after Nazi rule. And this was very strange because his entire method rested upon using one's own social location as the critical point of understanding. So when it came to himself, Mannheim, more than all the other figures here, regarded the traditional 19th century liberal Bildung as essentially individual, beyond religion and beyond nationalism. Now, we'll quickly turn to two related but autonomous institutions, which characterized, again in complex ways, the peculiar Frankfurt experience and the role Jewish intellectuals played in it. They were very far from the harmonizing tendencies of Mannheim and the Bildung idea. I needn't say much about the first institution. It doesn't need elaboration. Over the years, it has probably become the most famous intellectual grouping in the world. It's superfluous to elaborate on what it did, and I'm referring, of course, to the critical theorists who go by the name the Frankfurt School, or the opponents of the Frankfurt School, like Georg Lukács, called it the Grand Hotel Abyss, indicating their clear neo-Marxist rejection of revolutionary progress. They were a far more radical but essentially cultural critique of capitalism. This was very different from orthodox Marxism. From the beginning, they rejected a simple economic materialism and insisted on the cultural dynamics that underlay capitalist domination, including a damning critique of enlightenment, but also always keeping in mind some option of secular redemption. Again, the circumstances of the Frankfurter Schule founding were very Frankfurtian. Its active founder, Max Horkheimer, was engaged in the university, but he founded the institution as separate from it so that he would have some independence. And it was funded by a very wealthy German Jewish grain merchant, Hermann Weil. And it was Bertolt Brecht who sardonically said, here was a capitalist who provided the funds to investigate the sources of misery that he had created. The Institute of Social Research, as it was known, by the way, it was called the Institute of Social Research, but at the beginning, they wanted to call it the Institute for Marxism, but it was rejected as too provocative. And they kept academia at length because the Frankfurter Schule was about commitment, whereas the idea of the academic and the scholar is being impartial and being, if you like, independent and above the fray. So, just to give you a very quick list of thinkers, apart from Horkheimer, there is, of course, Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno, who nobody needs anywhere virtually in academic circles to ask who he was. But it included people like Erich Fromm, Henry Grossmann, Herbert Marcuse, Karl Grünberg, Franz Neumann, Julian Gumperz, Leo Löwenthal, Friedrich Pollock, and of course our old friend Siegfried Kracauer. it may come as not as a big surprise to you that these were all Jews. There were non-Jewish members, such as Karl August Wittfogel and Paul Massing. But Massing wrote afterwards, he never felt fully at home in the Frankfurter Schule because he wasn't Jewish. And the members of the Frankfurt School maybe would not have liked to hear it, but what Gershom Scholem said about them, I think, has a great deal of truth. He said that they are one of the most remarkable Jewish sects in Jewish history. I'm not sure they would have liked to hear that. For in those early years, while they didn't deny their Jewish origins, they were good Orthodox Marxists, they regarded themselves as cosmopolitan radicals and didn't pay particular attention to matters Jewish. But with the rise of fascism and Nazism, their Jewish awareness was increasingly important, and many of us are now clearly familiar with Horkheimer and Adorno's post-war career in Germany, their analyses of anti-Semitism, and their post-Holocaust thinking. But we should not elide the enormous impact exerted by World War I. In fact, almost all of the thinkers we've considered here, and not just the Frankfurt School, must be seen within the context of an acute sense of crisis generating the need for a new thinking. They were sensitive to the breakdown of traditional authority, contemptuous of the bourgeois present, suspicious of liberal pieties. They were all of these, as Hannah Arendt later put it. There was no possibility of an unmediated return to any of the previous options, whether they be German or European or Marxist or Jewish traditions. As Adorno put it, a totally new approach has to be adopted, one which would be capable of abruptly grasping and simultaneously shattering the totality and intellectual history involved. So it was not only reactionary forces of the right that rejected liberalism. It was equally these nonconformist intellectuals that proffered visions of renewal based on post-liberal frameworks. So most of these intellectuals were not concerned with Jewish matters. But now we must turn to one that was decidedly very much interested in Jewish matters and in an explicitly radical and existential way, seeking to enact a kind of renewed Jewish knowledge and learning and grappling with authentic Jewish sources. What is relevant to us here is that this attempted renaissance, the attempted recovery of a lost inheritance, was also built on post-liberal, post-Bildung assumptions. I'm referring, of course, to the by now famous Lehrhaus under the leadership of Franz Rosenzweig, who in 1924 declared the liberal German Jewish position, which has been the meeting ground to almost the whole of German Jewry for nearly half a century, has dwindled down to the size of a pinpoint. The Lehrhaus, as you know, was inspired by the charismatic Frankfurt Rabbi Anton Nobel and directed by Rosenzweig. Deeply informed by the existentialist tenor of the time, its ultimate aim was not purely intellectual or theological, but rather an existential quest for Jewish individual and collective being. Buber, of course, as you know, was deeply involved in this. And to some degree, what is interesting, the participation in the Lehrhaus overlapped with people at the university and the Institute of Social Research. Erich Fromm, Sigrid Krakauer, Leo Löwenthal, Ernst Simon all participated in its activities. Amongst the many people who taught there, we should mention Leo Strauss, Leo Beck, and thank goodness, and we'll come back to them, Bertha Pappenheim and Margareta Sussman. Now, the studies of the Lehrhaus looks like a traditional Bildungseducation, but it's not quite like that. By the way, if we're talking about German Jewry liberalism, Rosenzweig's political beliefs tended, you may not believe it, towards being a monarchist. That's kind of strange, but there you have it. What he was really about was very similar to the major texts. You know, his Stirn der Erlösung is one of the master texts of the Weimar Republic. And it has something in common with works that are totally different. For instance, Heidegger Sein und Zeit, Ernst Bloch Geist der Utopie, and Oswald Spengler's Untergang works. All these works were quasi-messianic, utopian, and apocalyptic in temperament. They questioned the very idea of historical progress and emphasized the importance of cataclysm and rupture. Rosenzweig said of Spengler, he is objectively the greatest philosopher that has appeared since Hegel. Not rational process and harmonious development will bring salvation, but rather epiphanic events, flashing moments that disrupt history and provide intimations of redemption. Or, as in the case of Rosenzweig, redemption didn't come through history. It was outside of history because the Jews really weren't part of history. They were kind of separate from the mankind history. For Rosenzweig, the Jews constituted a meta-historical community, a nation beyond history. So they were the realization of the future redemption within pre-Messianic time. What, together with these other thinkers, Rosenzweig's belief in gradual progressive history was now replaced by actualization at the moment, redemption as a constant, imminent possibility, and now a qualitative now or any given time, what he called Jetztzeit. It's possible at any moment it may flash through. So he replaced the conventional Enlightenment notion of time and development with the eternal Jewish cycle and linked it to Jetztzeit. Now you will be delighted to hear that I'm coming slowly to the end of this lecture. As we reach the end, what can we really conclude about the Jewishness of these very diverse figures? Before we even attempt to answer this, we have to face a dilemma. We have to find a balance between two opposing tendencies. There is, on the one hand, the temptation, which various committed Jewish and non-Jewish, even anti-Semitic circles like to do, is to find something inherently Judaic, inherently Jewish in these figures under investigation. If they happen to be born Jews, there's something inherently, essentially Jewish. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there is also the liberal blindness which denies any particularity to the Jews, any kind of defining moment. So we have to work our way carefully through this kind of thicket. The first option, which says Jews, if they're born Jews, there's something essentially Jewish, it takes away free choice. It doesn't allow the people the power of their own self-definition. And the second denies any particularity, doesn't affirm particularity. So when we speak of Frankfurt's Jewish intellectuals, what do we mean? What do we really mean? That they were Jewish because they were born as Jews and that this somehow endowed them with Jewish sensibility? That's clearly not the case. They differed radically in terms of their attitudes. In fact, we can go on and say from Buber's almost totalistic investment in being Jewish, you get to, I have to mention her now and not, I don't know if you like it, to Margarete Sussman, who by 1935 had come to, and she was a committed Jew. She was quite clearly Jewish and wrote about these things. But by 1935 had come to the conclusion that the vocation of Israel as a people is not self-realization, but self-surrender for the sake of a higher trans-historical goal, rendering the Jews' spiritual and physical demise as a realization of their divine destiny and their universal exilic exemplarity. Basically, she was arguing that the Jews, in a kind of Christian supersessional way, have to give up being Jews, something which Scholem described as a great inner demoralization. But that's not the point that I'm making here, is that there was such a great diversity, that there were so many opposing and extreme ruminations that were indicative of the confusion, the excitement, and the search that characterized these Jewish thinkers. You can't find any single political line. You have the liberal commitments of the Frankfurter Zeitung. You have the radical left, the humanist Zionism of Buber, the monarchistic ideas of Rosenzweig, and the very right-wing national convictions of people like Hans Kantorowicz. So you can't find a single Jewish political position. That is natural and to be expected. Only anti-Semites believe that there's one conspiratorial attitude. However, to deny any similarity, to deny any affinity, courts the danger of being colorblind, of not recognizing particularity. So there were no limits to acculturation. These were deeply cultured people in the Western tradition, but there were limits to the possibilities of assimilation. In the first place, this is a period in which no matter how undesired or how one reacted to it, the Judenfrage was always there and had to be confronted. Viewed from the outside, whether or not they were interested in their Jewishness, Jewish individuals were recognized as such. That is partly why even those secular Jews experienced a certain mutual recognition and often unstated affinity, a kind of safety and comfort in each other's company. Wasn't ideological, wasn't about studying Talmud, wasn't about being in Hebrew. It was a certain sense of affinity, a sense of, what's the word, Wahlverwandtschaft? I'm looking for the word in German for affinity. It was a kind of liminal Jewishness, without definition, no specific content, but it had a certain resonance. This is true if you look at their patterns of socialization, where they lived, and their education, and also marriage. But marriage is more complicated. We're coming to women now. Most of the people we have considered here did marry Jewish women, but this was not the case for all. Krakow and Horkheimer did not marry Jewish women, and Martin-Buber did not. He married Paula Winkler, who converted to Judaism. So we have to go beyond the sociological level and invoke the rather subtle observation by Sigmund Freud. I quote, "Jews possess the clear consciousness of an inner identity, the familiarity of the same psychological structure." And Frankfurt's own Franz Rosenzweig argued Jewishness is something infinitesimally small, yet immeasurably large, his most impenetrable secret, yet evident in every gesture and every word, especially in the most spontaneous of them. I think that this explains why so many cross-cutting networks existed amongst the people we've discussed. Indeed, some have described Weimar and thus Frankfurt intellectual culture as a kind of essentially inner Jewish dialogue. That's exaggerated, but here there is some truth to this. This is what Leo Löwenthal writes. About a year after my meeting with Siegfried Kracauer, he introduced me to Adorno, who was then 18 years old. I introduced him to my friend Ernst Simon, who won me over to a very messianic Zionism. Through Ernst Simon, Kracauer met Rabbi Nobel. Through Nobel, Kracauer first met Martin-Buber and later Franz Rosenzweig. In the spring of 1922, I introduced him to Ernst Bloch, and in turn, he introduced me to Horkheimer, who was a good friend of Adorno's. So it seems quite clear that here is the kind of sense of communal affinity without necessarily defining it in concrete Judaic terms. I will qualify what I've said basically about, not about the revolt against Bildung and the revolt against liberalism, because ultimately, almost all of them had one possession of the classical Bildung, which they never sacrificed and which remained. And that had to do with the primacy of culture. That culture is almost always at the center. And even the Frankfurter Schule, its critique of capitalism is based on its concept of culture. How does culture operate in this? Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily good, because if you really believe that culture is everything, there was a great deal of innocence and naivete, because lots of people were not thinking about culture, but were thinking about politics, which was brutal and rough. And one of the problems of these Jewish intellectuals was the underestimation of the role of power and macht when it came to political life. And against, as I am against contribution history, the fact remains that while the Frankfurt Jewish community numbered only 30,000, about 5 or 6% of the city, its Jewish intellectuals, scholars, philanthropists, journalists, critics played a really rich role in shaping Frankfurt and Weimar's cultural and intellectual landscape. Their heterodox approaches, their visions of rescue and rejuvenization, and their humanizing observations make the loss and the tragedy that soon was to envelop them even more sad and horrific. Now, this was supposed to be the end of the lecture, and you were all supposed to stand up and cheer. Not because you liked the lecture, but you're relieved that it's ended. But I have to add something here, which I noticed. And this again has to do with patriarchal culture. Why are there so many men? What about the women? Well, first of all, thank goodness for Margareta Sussman, we've dealt with her. But Bertha Pappenheim? What a woman. The street should be named after. Of course, you all know about Anna O and her mental disease and the questions of Breuer and Freud, and she's supposed to be part of the famous talking cure. But when Pappenheim was in Binswager's sanatorium, she cursed psychoanalysis and said that it's a big swindle and it had nothing to do with her recovery. After that, Bertha Pappenheim, as I'm sure you know, became an immensely important social worker, a writer, and one of the first people to recognize the importance and work against Jewish prostitution, forced upon these women And in that sense, by the way, I wanted to talk about the women of the men. But Bertha Pappenheim never married, didn't have children. She did have a very close friend. I think her name was Hannah Kominsky. There's no suggestion of lesbianism here that I've ever come across. She just had a very close friend. So we have to pay our tribute to Bertha Pappenheim, who remained an Orthodox Jew, very progressive, very for female emancipation, but remained an Orthodox Jew. Now, Margareta Sussman did marry, later divorced the Jewish painter Edvard von Bendemer. So let me just spend 2 pages on the women of the men, which is terrible. Some of them, as was the practice at the time, would just do the typing, the secretarial typing, or they would keep the household. That and staying in the background were what good bourgeois wives were meant to do. And I'm not going to name who they were. Amongst the intellectuals I've spoken about, there were some. But many others were not at all passive, and they really deserve recognition. Paula Winkler, Buber's wife, was a vivacious, intellectually engaged, independent writer and woman, became a distinguished novelist, writing under the pen name of Georg Munch, and played a very active part in Buber's literary work. Until 1958, her death, she was an advisor to Buber on matters of grammar, style, and content. Siegfried Krakauer's wife, Lily Krakauer, was a distinguished professional researcher and photographer. And she was not just her husband's assistant, but an active corroborator. And Krakauer himself observed in his 1947 From Caligari to Hitler about his wife, "Whatever I may say to thank her is insufficient. As always, she has helped me in the preparation of this book, and as always, I have benefited greatly from her capacity of penetrating everything to the core." And as Krakauer said, she wants to remain in the background, something which is still part of the problem. What about Gretel Adorno? Not dissimilar. She was born Margareta Karplus. She received her doctorate in chemistry at the age of 23 under somebody no less than Max Born. It's not sufficiently well known that not only was she a scientist, but a serious and dedicated thinker who, together with Horkheimer and Adorno, developed the manuscript for Dialectica der Aufklärung, and subsequently worked with Adorno in almost all his intellectual endeavors. She was a very tolerant woman because she explicitly discussed with Adorno and took notes about his multiple affairs. I hope you get that. Maybe there's a problem of language. Adorno was a womanizer, and here he is discussing with his wife about his women. Erich Fromm married Frieda Reichmann, who was older than him and his therapist. She was a very respected psychiatrist, an expert in schizophrenia, and under the impression of the Jewish Renaissance, Reichmann Fromm, who was religious, established a private psychoanalytic sanatorium in 1924 Heidelberg that combined therapy and analytic sessions with Jewish kashrut, dietary rules, and Shabbat observance, Sabbath observance. And the place was jokingly called the Torah-peuticum. Instead of the therapeuticum, the Torah-peuticum. Another example of the kind of crazy experimental atmosphere of young German Weimar Jewish intellectual. I'll end here with some rather sad but heroic stories. Edith Hahn, Rosenzweig's wife, was an extremely intelligent and physically attractive woman who shared Rosenzweig's values and goals, who enjoyed intellectuals' conversation, exactly the sort of Jewish woman that Rosenzweig needed. Yet she was aware from the beginning that Rosenzweig was long involved with another woman, Margaret Rosenstock-Huessy, and that Rosenzweig's attitude to Edith was at best ambivalent and at other times indifferent, perhaps even hostile. Yet when he contracted his horrible illness, it was Edith's care and her active help in his writing that is not well enough known. Through his paralysis, it was not just Buber who was engaged with Rosenzweig, with the translation, but Edith, who didn't just transcribe, but was a full partner in that tragic, heroic enterprise, creatively interpreting the slightest movement of Rosenzweig's body. The translation was not Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber, but also Edith Rosenzweig. I'm going to end here with the most painful and shocking case in our survey of the women that I've dealt with. I'm talking about Josef Roth's wife and his relationship with his wife, Friedel Reichler, whom he married in 1922. Their union was predictably obsessive and unstable. After 5 mad years with the ever-moving, alcoholic, and philandering Roth, she felt exhausted and forsaken, and then was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Constantly in and out of treatment, she never really recovered, and in 1940, she was gassed in the Nazi euthanasia program. To what extent Roth was responsible for her condition is not clear, but he did say, I, Moshe Joseph Roth, I haunted her. These women, conventional, remarkable, creative, suffering, they still remain in the shadows. But given the interlocking nature of these circles, one has to assume that many of them knew each other. I'm suggesting to this conference that one of the things that needs to be done is an honest collective biography of these German, Weimar, Frankfurt Jewish women who were the wives and the lovers of these intellectuals. Thank you very much.